Hello, everyone. I'm Al Sweigart. It's a great honor to be here speaking at PyCon Philippines. So, to tell you a little bit about myself, I have a few hobbies. I like to write software. I like to write books about writing software. I like to fold origami. And I also just like wandering around cities and urban areas on foot and just seeing what's out there. The thing that all four of these have in common is that they're all really cheap hobbies. All my luggage that I packed for this trip was just my laptop, a pair of shoes, and a single sheet of paper. So I flew here from San Francisco. I've been living there for the last 11 years, and then I grew up in Texas. My father's side of the family comes from Germany several generations back, and my mother is a Japanese immigrant. So I'm an American, and I'm speaking from my experience as an American. And when I say America, I don't mean the continents of North and South America. I'm from the United States of America, so we just refer to America as the U.S. So maybe American isn't a great way to describe me. I'm more of a U.S. Asian, I guess. But yeah, all of these things have affected my life and my career, and I sort of wonder how I got here, here in general, but also here, standing in this room, giving this talk at PyCon. And the reason I was invited here was because in 2015, I wrote a book called Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. This is what I'm most well known for. It's a beginner programming book. In fact, now all of my friends, whenever they introduce me to people, say, "This is Al, he writes Python books. He wrote Automate the Boring Stuff with Python." And I think, well, I've done other things with my life besides this. And then I realized, no, I haven't. This is the most significant thing I've accomplished so far. Nobody cares about the origami. And so this book really took off in popularity, and I think one of the reasons that happened is because, for one, I released it online for free under a Creative Commons license. So people are free to download this book, read it, talk about it with their friends, share it with other people, and I think that's what really built up the word of mouth that ended up selling more books. So putting my book for free on the internet sells more copies. And I have no idea how capitalism works, but it apparently does for me. So I turned out I was very lucky about that. And the other reason why this book seems to do so well is because I didn't write it for programmers. I didn't even really write it for computer science majors or even just for people who were nerdy and thought learning to program might be fun. If anything, I wrote this for office workers or academics, people who just sit down at a computer every day and play with Excel, and if they knew how to code and write little scripts, they could automate a lot of their job and be much more productive. So it turns out Python's a great language for that. So I came up with the right idea at the right time with the right language, and so a lot of those just fell into place. I was really lucky about that. Automate isn't my first book. I wrote 3 other books before this, going back to 2010, and if you look at the first edition for a lot of these books, they're all right. It's clear that I did not have a lot of writing experience when I wrote these books, but I've had a lot of practice. So by the time I wrote Automate, I had already had the experience of going through the entire process with 3 other books. And that's really fortunate because not everybody has that opportunity. You know, some people have to work 2 jobs and they don't have time to write books in their spare time, or some people have to take care of their kids, or some people have health issues that prevent them from working a full day and then going home and working some more. So I've been very fortunate about that. But really, if you want to trace back to how I got here, standing on this stage right now, I would go back even further than these Python books. I would go to 1988, because that is the year that I was introduced to Super Mario Brothers. So when I was 5 years old, my older sister and I got a Nintendo for Christmas. And I started playing video games, and I really loved video games. And then a few years later, when I was 9 years old, a friend of mine found a book on programming in BASIC in the school library. And I was really into video games, so I wanted to make my own video games. And so I got into programming that way. And that was a really fortunate series of events that I had. Yeah, so that was how I learned to program. A lot of programmers love telling the story of how they learned to program. When they start telling you this, you can see their eyes light up. and you realize you're probably in store for a really boring story. But I actually hate telling people how I learned to program. I really hate telling this, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But let me go back even further in time to 1972, which is when Pong came out. This was the first popular video game that came out. The little game with the paddles and there's a ball bouncing back and forth between them. A lot of people really loved this game, and it came out in the early 70s. And then over the next 10 years, even though video games were new, they started losing their appeal. A lot of the home video game console hardware was expensive. Many of the games just weren't that fun. In fact, if you go to, I believe 1983 is when the video game E.T. came out. This was based off of the really popular movie that came out, and they wanted to make more money, so they just pushed out really quickly this video game. This is a terrible video game, by the way. It's really confusing. The graphics aren't that good. It's hard to tell what you're supposed to be doing. Those are apparently holes that you're not supposed to fall into. I have no idea what the number at the bottom means. Sometimes there's a question mark or an arrow at the top or nothing or 3. This game was horrible. In fact, it's often cited as one of the worst video games of all time and one of the biggest commercial failures in video game history. Yikes. All of this culminated in 1983 to the video game crash. This was when video games, there were so many poor quality video games, people lost interest in them. And the video game industry went from a $3.2 billion industry to $100 million in 1 year. That's a 97% drop in 1 year. Now, arguably, what saved video games as an industry and as a form of entertainment and as a source of inspiration to many programmers like myself was Mario. In 1985, the first Nintendo came out, and Super Mario Bros. Went on to become the most popular video game for the next 3 decades. It would be the late 2000s before another game came out that sold more copies than this one from 1985. And it wasn't just Super Mario Bros. There were many games from Nintendo that were really well designed and high quality. And you can see a lot of this clever design in the very first level of Super Mario Bros. I have it right here. So this is how the game starts. You're at the very first level. Mario is on the left side of the screen, facing right, and there's a lot of space open there. So it's really obvious where you're supposed to go. All of the levels are designed this way. Every single level, if you want to advance, you just start moving to the right. So you start moving to the right, and you see this flashing block. This is the first object that you see in the game, and so that captures your attention, and you want to move towards it. But then there's this bad guy on the screen, and the only way around this first bad guy that you encounter is by jumping over it. So it sets up this gate that you have to learn this skill, jumping, before you can continue on with this game. And right after that, the next flashing block that you meet has the very first mushroom, and this mushroom pops out of the top of the block and starts moving to the left, and it falls down, it hits the green pipe and bounces back, and starts headed towards Mario. So you're almost guaranteed to collect this mushroom. It's effortless in how you encounter and discover this first power-up. There's lots of things that you learn without a single word being said. Mushrooms move on their own, they're affected by gravity, they bounce off of solid objects, and when you collect them, you get a power-up. And all of that is conveyed without a lot of text. It's all just so natural. Right after this, there's a series of green pipes, and they get a little bit taller after each one. So in Mario, you jump higher by holding the jump button down for longer periods of time. And this is a really subtle skill. I mean, it actually breaks the laws of physics, because your actions after Mario has already jumped dictates how high you go. That's not how reality works, but it's how the video game world works, and they needed to teach this concept. And they do this with just a series of pipes. And so you start to realize, oh, if I hold down the jump button even longer, I can jump up higher. This ensures that you're not going to get so far into the game and then without learning this skill. And you're tested on this right after those pipes. You encounter the first bottomless pit. Now, if you jump too soon, you're going to end up, instead of landing on the other side of the pit, you're going to fall down into the pit. So to prevent that from happening, they have this hidden power-up right here. So if you accidentally jump too soon, not only will you not die, you're also going to discover, oh, there's hidden blocks. It's just taught you this concept, all without saying a single word. The rest of the level is just great. I really encourage people to just look at it from a designer's perspective and all the different things that it teaches you. At one point, there's this weird pyramid structure right here, and if you fall into it, it's not a big deal. You can just jump right out. But right after that point, there's another pyramid, and this time it has a bottomless pit. So it's prepared you, and then right after that, you're tested on this ability to jump over the pit. There is so much clever design into this video game that you just didn't see in earlier video games. This was like, Super Mario Brothers was the iPhone of the 1980s, really. And you can't really talk about Super Mario Brothers without talking about this man, Shigeru Miyamoto, who was one of the designers of Super Mario Brothers, and he's been designing video games for Nintendo for the last 30 years. I found a great interview with him, and he said something that really leapt out at me. He said, well, early on, the people who made video games, they were technologists, they were programmers, they were hardware designers, but I wasn't. I was a designer. I studied industrial design. I was an artist. I drew pictures. I think this is really important because if you go back to the earlier video games in the Atari era, a lot of the games were designed by the same person who programmed them. I'm going to use one example. Here's Adventure from Atari. You can tell that this is a game that a programmer designed because its name is Adventure. Yeah. So I've seen how programmers name their variables. It's pretty much that level of effort. It's like, well, what should we call our new adventure game? How about Adventure? That sounds good. So a lot of the graphics for these Atari games was limited by the technology at the time, but this is what Adventure told you a dragon looked like. It's a bunch of squiggles, and it kind of looks like a yellow duck. And this is what Adventure told the player what they looked like, a square. You were this square that moved around the game board. And Adventure was one of the better Atari games as well. So many other games were just not really well thought out, the same way that Super Mario Brothers was. So video games are really what made me into a programmer. And yet, it wasn't a programmer who helped save the video game industry. And I was very lucky that this non-technical person who didn't know how to program helped save a very technical industry. So I said I really hate telling the story of how I learned to program. I'll fast forward into 2000 and tell that story now. So in 2000, I was in high school, and let's see, at this point, I had learned BASIC a little bit when I was 9 years old, and then I learned some Visual Basic and C. And in high school, I learned some HTML to make web pages, and to make some web apps, I learned Perl and a little bit of JavaScript. And I tell people this, and I really hate telling people this, because it makes people think that I was like one of those genius programmer kids. And so many people are really worried about this. I constantly hear people asking, am I too old to start learning how to program? And some of these people are 22 years old, and they think that it's way too late for them. Like, you know, if you want to be a software engineer, or at least a good software engineer, you have to have started programming when you were in diapers. Like, you're born, you take your first steps and say your first words, then you start your first startup, then you go to kindergarten, and then you drop out of kindergarten so that you can start your second startup and become a millionaire. And it's really ridiculous, and I hate telling people like, well, I learned how to program in the 3rd grade, but at the same time, it wasn't that impressive because I didn't really learn all that much. I mean, the games that I made were nowhere as good as the Nintendo or Atari games. I was just sort of playing around, and in the year 2000, I was in high school. This sort of captures how inept I was at programming. I was one of 3 students from my high school that was selected to go to a programming competition in my city. I was growing up in Houston, Texas. And this competition, there were 30 other teams from 30 other high schools. And the competition was that in 3 hours, we had to solve 10 programming problems. And each problem was worth 1 point. And at the end of the 3 hours, my team, the team that I was on, had a final score of 1 point. So these weren't difficult programming problems either. They were just problems I had never seen before, and I wasn't clever enough to figure them out. So I was not a genius programmer kid. And in fact, the other two students on my team, they weren't genius programmer kids either. And in this competition with the 30 other teams, our score of 1 point tied with half of them. They were not genius programmer kids either. And that's fine. You don't have to be incredibly clever in order to develop these skills later on. I look at this list and, I didn't really know all that much about each of these languages. I think if you wanted to learn everything I had learned between the ages of 9 and graduating high school, this would take you maybe about 24 weekends of your time to learn what I learned in that several-year period. Really, it wasn't these languages that was the most important thing that I learned. The most important thing that I learned as a kid was that programming is something that I'm capable of doing. And a lot of people don't learn this. They don't have people who tell them this, or they have people who tell them that they can't program. I was very lucky that I learned to program at the time and in the way that I did. And I think about this a lot, just how I was so lucky throughout my life. And I wonder, how can we make other people also lucky in the same way that we all were lucky and learned to code? So that's what I want to talk about. This is about creating communities that welcome new people and attract new people and help them learn to code and continue learning to code. Because if you think that programming is really just all the technical aspects of it, if you think programming is just memorizing algorithms and mathematics and, neural networks and compiler optimizations, and you disqualify all the other skills that people have, you're going to end up with this. So Python's a great language in that it attracts a wide variety of people. It's really great. I'm going to talk about this company, OXO, that makes kitchen utensils for people with arthritis. They wanted to design kitchen utensils so that even if you didn't have that much grip strength, you could use them. This is their potato peeler. It has a wide rubber grip. I'm going somewhere with this, trust me. So it was really easy to use. It doesn't take a lot of effort to hold this tool. And they started selling this, and a lot of people like this tool because it turns out if you make a tool that's really easy to use, everyone's going to like that. And Python's the same way. Python's a great tool to teach beginners because it's easy to learn and easy to use, but even if you're an experienced software developer, you like Python for those reasons. And a lot of this comes from the history of Python and the history of this other language called ABC. Guido van Rossum worked on this language in the 1980s at CWI in Amsterdam, and he credits it a lot with influencing his design of the Python language. It's so important to create these tools that are not exclusive, or you don't feel like you have to be a complete genius and a master programmer or hacker or anything like that to use. So all of that has led me here to PyCon today. And I start thinking about, how can we start building these communities? And the good news is, that's something that we're doing right now. You're doing it right now just by attending PyCon. In fact, there's a whole lot of lists, a big list of things that you can do to help encourage building these communities. I went to my first PyCon in 2011. It was US PyCon. And after so many years, I started developing this list of things that I had noticed. So a few years ago, I gave a lightning talk called The Shirt Color Trick, or How to Do PyCon. So this is the big list of advice I have for how to make the most of your time at PyCon. And the first bit of advice that I have is skip all the talks. That's actually a terrible advice. No, do go to the talks. They're really great and you'll learn a lot. But when I first went to PyCon, I went to as many talks as possible, just one right after the other. And then I learned a lot of things, and then I went home and mostly forgot them. But the mistake that I had made was thinking that PyCon is all about the talks, and it's not. The main reason that you want to go to PyCon is to meet new people. What other time are you going to be in a room with this many Python programmers? yeah, this is a great opportunity to take advantage of that and meet new people. So even if that involves just not going to a talk and just hanging out in the hallways and continuing to have conversations with people, that's the real value of going to a conference for Python. In fact, let's go ahead and start meeting new people right now. Turn to your left and turn to your right and introduce yourself to the person sitting right next to you. Just tell them your name right now. Excellent. Right, hey, now we've just met a lot of new people. All right, so remember, you're here to meet people. It's much more important than the talks. However, so when you're having these conversations in the hallway, go ahead and we tend to stand in a circle when we're talking to different people. Go ahead and stand like Pac-Man. I make a lot of video game references in this talk, by the way. Stand like Pac-Man, so you have an open space so that other people can join your conversation instead of trying to squeeze in between other people. Just something to keep in mind when you're having these discussions. The next bit of advice I have, so I want you to skip the talks. I also want you to skip your friends as well. Ignore your friends. They're not your friends. Well, they are your friends, but the point of PyCon is to meet people, and you want to meet new people. So instead of just hanging out with the people that you already know, start meeting new people and then having conversations with them. And then later you can catch up with your friends afterwards and invite the new friends that you've just made. Finally, wow, the lunches were great. There's another lunch tomorrow. When you have your lunch, don't eat alone. I give this piece of advice, but I generally don't follow it because I like picking up my lunch and then standing off in the corner, just eating by myself and not talking to anyone. No, don't eat lunch alone. Be sure to actually just join a group and say hello and meet people, because lunches are a great way to meet people. And once you do start meeting people, be sure to hand them your business card. And if you didn't bring business cards, that's fine. You can just give them your email address, but be sure to collect some way of contacting them later on. Otherwise, what I did in the first several PyCons that I went to is I would meet all these people and think like, wow, these are all such interesting people, and then I would go home and never talk to them ever again. That was kind of a mistake. So I had printed up business cards, and I realized a couple things about business cards. Just order the minimum quantity. It's cheaper per card if you order 40,000 business cards, but you're actually probably going to want to change something about those cards before you're done handing them all out, so you'd end up throwing them all out anyway. And when you do print up business cards for yourself, just put public information on it, and just public information. So here's my business card. I don't have my home address on this, and I don't even have my phone number on it. I can always write it down if they want that information later, but somebody should be able to take a picture of your business card and then post it on the internet for everybody in the world to see, and you should just be fine with that. If there's something that makes you feel a little bit squeamish about doing that, just take that information off. And so you're meeting people and you're exchanging information. Be sure to actually follow up with them after the conference. Even if it's just a quick email, actually try to take the steps to follow up and continue discussions that you had. Twitter is a great resource for doing this. If you don't have a Twitter account, you can just sign up for free. You don't even have to follow that many people. But it's great because you can just casually reply to other people's posts and have conversations and just sort of build up rapport that way. Hey, has anybody ever noticed that if you turn the Twitter logo upside down, it kind of looks like Sonic the Hedgehog? Yeah, anyway, this is just something I noticed when I was putting this talk together. Okay, so the most important thing that I'm probably going to say in this entire talk is telling you about the shirt color trick. So we, and when I say we, I mean humans, we have this tendency to put ourselves around people who remind us of ourselves. And this can be, we hang around people of the same gender or age or race, but it can also be other things too. We like to hang around people who dress the way we do or talk the way we do, or even they're as tall as we are or something like that. This is a really small bias that people have, but it can have very large effects. And to demonstrate this, there's a website that everyone should check out called The Parable of the Polygons. This is a website that has several simulations that you can run. And these simulations have neighborhoods of triangles and squares. And it's not that triangles and squares don't like each other. They just have a slight preference for hanging out with other people who are their same shape. So triangles like hanging out with other triangles, and squares like hanging out with other squares. In fact, if their immediate neighbors are less than a third of their same shape, they just want to move somewhere else where they're around people who are more similar to how they are. But if you run the simulation, this very small bias has very large effects. You can see after the end of it is done and everybody's happy, you see a large amount of segregation that comes. And remember, this is just less than a third. It's not even that they demand that everyone or most people be their same shape. What's worse about this is that you can get rid of this bias entirely later on, but the neighborhood will stay segregated. In fact, the way that you can get rid of this segregation is to add a slight bias against being around everyone who is like you. So in this case of the simulation, if more than 80% of the neighbors are like that shape, then they're going to move. And with just this small bias against having this sort of uniformity, you can get rid of segregation entirely. So I think this is really important, and it's important when it comes to, squares and triangles, but it's also important for all people. It's important to be around others who are not like us. For example, like programmers and designers need to talk to each other. So in order to combat this, it's, I don't know, there's, how do you get rid of bias, and how do you ensure that you're forcing yourself to actually be around new people? Well, there's a lot of complicated ways you can go about it, but the shirt color trick is a really simple algorithm for doing this. Here's the shirt color trick. 1, think of a color. 2, find the closest person wearing a shirt of that color. And 3, talk to that person. So I'm going to demonstrate this right now. I'm just going to come up with well, I can't get rid of this, so I'll just take it with me. So I'm just going to think of a random color. It's, I don't know, it can be any color whatsoever. I'm just going to say red, and I'll just talk to the first person who is wearing a red shirt and closest to me. Hey, how's it going? I'm Al. Okay, awesome. Well, I'm in the middle of giving a talk, so I have to get back to that. Oh, okay, well, no, I'm fine. Perfect. Okay, I'll see you later, Andrew. So this is a way, so don't think about it. In fact, the more you think about it, the more bias is going to enter into your brain. So just come up with a color and then just say, okay, first person who's closest to me wearing that color, I'm going to talk to them. So it's a nice way to randomly select who you're going to talk to. And if you keep doing this, you'll find that you're forcing yourself out of your normal bubble and talking to a larger variety of people. So that's all my advice for how to do PyCon. 1, go to PyCon, which you've already done, congratulations. Be sure to skip the talks because you want to meet new people. Stand like Pac-Man so that other people can join your conversations. Skip your friends because you want to make new ones. Don't eat alone. Remember to bring business cards. If somebody takes a picture of your business card and puts it on the internet, and you're fine with that, that's how you know you have the right amount of information there. Be sure to follow up with people and don't just meet them and then never see them ever again. And if you want to have some really simple way of talking to a larger variety of people, you can just use the shirt color trick to introduce yourself. So let's go ahead and start meeting people once again because you've probably already forgotten their name. So go ahead and meet each other right now. Turn to your left and turn to your right and reintroduce yourself to the person next to you. Thank you very much for having me here. It was great talking. Thank you very much to the sponsors, and thank you for coming to PyCon. Thanks.